Whether it be operating as a master of the synthesizer in the pioneering glam rock outfit Roxy Music, writing atmospheric ambient soundtracks, or producing for the likes of Devo, The Talking Heads, and Bowie, among others, it goes without saying that Brian Eno is undisputedly one of the most enigmatic and polymorphous musicians to ever emerge out of the British rock canon. He wears many hats: producer, composer, visual artist, activist. There's pretty much nothing that he hasn't done or accomplished. He is a self-described non-musician who has always had a penchant for the avant-garde and the unusual, which was shaped by most of his childhood and his art school background. He mastered some of his most critically acclaimed contributions to music through improvisation, including two of his first solo albums, Here Come the Warm Jets and Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. Brian Eno was born into a working-class family in a village called Melton, on the northeast fringes of Woodbridge, a small conservative Anglo town in Suffolk, England. In interviews, he has frequently opened up about how his hometown has shaped most of his work. I've always enjoyed being melancholy, perhaps because that mood is very much a feature of the environment where I grew up. It's a very bleak place, and most visitors find it quite miserable. I don't think it's miserable, but it definitely is sort of a lost place in a lost time. Nothing has changed in that part of England for many hundreds of years. Eno comes from a long line of part-time musicians and engineers in his family who always had a knack for tinkering with machinery. His father, who worked for the postal service, would repair clocks and watches on the side, and his grandfather was a multi-instrumentalist who played the saxophone, the bassoon, and also built and repaired pianos and church organs. As a child growing up in the overwhelmingly white and conservative town of Woodbridge, attending Catholic school at St. Joseph's College in Ipswich, Eno found solace in the blues, doo-wop, and classic R&B records by the likes of Don and Juan, the Lafayettes, and the Silhouettes, as well as legendary rock and roll figures like Little Richard. I can never explain to people what the effect of that was. Not Elvis, but the weirder things. Things like Get a Job by the Silhouettes, and What's Your Name by Don and Juan. The a cappella stuff I had no other experience of. It was like music from nowhere, and I liked it a lot. Another seminal figure who influenced Eno's entire career was the post-war avant-garde composer John Cage and his 1952 piece, 433. 4.5 minutes of utter silence, except for the sounds of mundane life like traffic, the wind, the ticking of a watch, and heartbeats, which forced listeners to question the very nature of sound itself. Another extremely influential figure for Eno was the work of Dutch modernist painter Piet Mondrian, which Eno discovered when he went to visit his uncle, who was an art collector. In my early teens, I started painting watercolors, and I have very vivid memories of sitting cross-legged in leafy summer lanes with my paper block on my knees and a little box of Winsor and Newtons. I loved the different grades of drawing pencils and was proud of having every one from 3H to 6B. I remember once I sat down to start a picture and surprised a grass snake, which wriggled out from under me and shot off into the undergrowth. I still recall these times as the happiest of my childhood. I used to get a funny feeling in my stomach when I was alone in a new place like that. I suppose I'm still looking for that funny feeling when I'm making something new. In the summer of 1964, Eno began attending Ipswich School of the Arts, where his instructors instilled in him a more conceptual approach to thinking and creativity. The first semester was devoted to destroying ready-made answers that the students might have. In fact, 3 kids had nervous breakdowns in that time. The first term was specifically designed to dismantle the damage that had been done by education that everyone had gone through before. It got rid of the old rules that said this is possible and this isn't, and instead said we're not going to tell you what is possible or isn't. We're going to teach you techniques for entertaining all kinds of possibilities at all times. After spending most of his time in London attending performances by experimental composers and musicians like Cornelius Cardew, Philip Glass, and Steve Reich, Eno, despite having no formal training in music himself, became eager to get his hands on tape recorders, and soon started experimenting with sound manipulation. After he transferred to Winchester School of Art, Eno began staging several experimental Cajun-style performances. One of the people he crossed paths with at this point in his life was singer-songwriter and frontman of psychedelic folk rock outfit The Soft Boys, Robin Hitchcock, who was attending Winchester College at the time. Eno staged a music event in a 14th century flint-walled cellar, essentially a dungeon with electricity. He had unscrewed the college's 60-watt light bulb and inserted his own blue bulb. A reel-to-reel tape recorder stood on a bare table beneath the light, playing Dylan's Ballad of Hollis Brown backwards, while somebody I didn't recognize was bowing a one-string violin. A microphone ran from the tape machine into the audience, where it was draped enticingly over the chair in front of me. About 15 boys, chaperoned by one of the younger, hipper teachers, came in and sat in the chairs. Eno lit a stick of incense, started the tape machine, and nodded to the violinist. After a while, I tapped the mic in front of me. It didn't seem to be switched on. I sang along with the backwards Bob Dylan, but that didn't come out either. Eventually, the music finished. I can't remember if we clapped or not. After hearing the Velvet Underground's debut in 1967, Eno was inspired to start performing in musical ensembles, staging several different performances at several universities and schools in the area. And it was at a 1968 performance he gave at Reading University's Student Union, where he first met a saxophone-toting grammar school boy from Westminster, Andy Mackay. A few years later, when Eno was living in London, he reunited with Mackay, who told him that his band was looking for somebody with a tape recorder to do their demos. The band in question was a blossoming art rock outfit helmed by Brian Ferry, a Newcastle Fine Arts alum with a penchant for old Hollywood glamour and modernist theatrics. The rest of the band consisted of Mackay on saxophone, Graham Simpson on bass, and occasionally John Porter on lead guitar before they found Phil Manzanera. This was the band that the people would come to know as the art school glam rock pioneers Roxy Music. At his initial meetings with Ferry, Eno was immediately taken by Mackay's VCS3 synthesizer. With some encouragement, Eno ended up taking the synth home with him and experimenting with oscillations, pitch shifting, and cross-patching, which immediately impressed Ferry when they came to visit his place at Grove Park. Brian had all his wires and gadgets set up there. It was a real mess of a place. It was fantastic. A maze of wiring, leads, bits of old speakers everywhere, old amps, and Aladdin's cave of barely held together technology. During their initial recordings, Eno was running practically everything through the VCS3 synthesizer. Keyboards, guitar tones, even Ferry's own voice, causing intense distortions and extreme tonal shifts, modeling his approach after Pete Sinfield, who had also used the VCS3 synthesizer for sound manipulation with King Crimson. And coincidentally enough, Sinfield would end up producing Roxy Music's eponymous debut album as well. Roxy Music's first album was recorded on a budget of £5,000 and eventually distributed through Island Records. It was recorded in a whirlwind of 19 days. Eno and Sinfield clashed a bit at first, Sinfield having no clue how he would be able to translate Eno's odd manipulation of the synthesizer onto tape. Initially, I thought Brian was a nuisance, but later I've recognized he is a man doing most of my act, and Lord love him, frequently doing it much better. The album's violent opener remake remodel didn't contain any middle eights, but instead these bursting guitar and saxophone solos, with Eno's synthesizer creating a climax of malfunctioning Android sounds. On Ladytron, Eno also managed to create sonic waves of a sci-fi lunar landscape on his VCS-3. Roxy Music's eccentricity and deliberate camp was not lost on people, and for many people that was also enough to put them off the band. They were immediately polarizing from the beginning, and that was kind of the point. The band was never afraid to turn up the absurdity and the over-the-top output, which was amplified in the music, the visuals, and the fashion. Roxy Music was a rock band with a rather peculiar perspective. It was all about creating a collage of popular cultural elements, unallowable colors, leopard skins, quiffs, pastiches of rock and roll, and it was a group based on a complete confusion of musical personalities. According to Eno, his elaborate high-camp presentation in Roxy's early days, which included leopard print jackets, shoulder pads, gold lame gloves, and several different couture outfits, was a visual strategy that he used in order to prevent the rest of the band from upstaging him at gigs, especially since his job was extremely technically advanced and wouldn't allow him the freedom to roam around on stage or be front and center. What I was doing involved such small movements. It was like putting a screw in a watch, so my only solution was to develop clothes that would amplify small movements. This was around the same time when Roxy Music's management, e.g., was booking several gigs for them in the US in hopes that the band would be able to break America. And this was also an extremely tumultuous time for the band. Ferry couldn't stand the tediousness of doing press all the time, while Eno often relished the attention and managed to always find humor in answering the same questions constantly. As Roxy prepared to record their second album, For Your Pleasure, Ferry's grip started to tighten. He started ruling that Eno's technical prowess would ultimately have to take a backseat to Ferry's songwriting, as well as the rest of the band. And this was the beginning of when the working relationship between Eno and Ferry started to fracture a bit. Eno would go on to say that he felt the For Your Pleasure sessions were unnecessarily rushed. This album also has a fair amount of highlights. The VCS-3 filtered harmonica solos on the sinister, krautrock-leaning The Bogus Man, as well as Phil Manzanera's flashy pyrotechnics on In Every Dream Home a Heartache, is a massive standout moment. But this was also when Ferry was leaning more into the conventional rock ballad structure, and Eno was not on board with the direction that Ferry insisted on taking the band in. So he departed. The thing I really enjoyed about Roxy was the diversity of the band. The fact that there was always tension between a lot of different musical ideas. I like to think I encouraged this tension. I always said that we shouldn't have smoothed things out by saying it's this kind of band or that. We must allow it to be a unit, that the tension can move in any direction, which is sometimes rough on the edges but is generally interesting. Brian and I fell out because he couldn't agree with this. As Eno began to move on from Roxy Music, there was one lurking problem that he couldn't shake. He was deep in debt, and with over 70% of the Roxy royalties going to Ferry, Eno was going to need another solution to make a living, and would have to think of something fast. It was around this same time when Eno decided to make something with King Crimson frontman and guitar virtuoso Robert Fripp. Eno and Fripp began to regularly cross paths when Eno was invited by Robert Wyatt to contribute to a matching mole record, which Fripp was producing. The two began facilitating collaborative sessions where they would improvise together, with Fripp playing his guitar over Eno's tape loops. After Eno left Roxy, him and Fripp recorded a collaborative album together at Command and Air Studios, which they called No Pussyfooting. Using a tape system of reel-to-reel recorders that were developed by Terry Riley and Pauline Oliveros, Eno used his delay system to capture and loop Fripp's layered improvisations, which resulted in two 20-minute-long ambient tracks that were cut up into sections. And this was around the first time that Eno began to lean into making ambient music. However, still in debt, there was an insane amount of pressure on Eno to deliver a commercially viable project. And commercial rock wasn't exactly his area of expertise, as an avant-garde non-musician. During the sessions for his debut solo album, Here Come the Warm Jets, Eno invited an array of unorthodox rock instrumentalists to contribute to the album, including Fripp, Mackay, and Manzanera, as well as Lloyd Watson and Chris Spedding, acclaimed guitarist and record producer who had recorded the first Sex Pistols demos. The album was recorded on an extremely tight budget at Majestic Studios, otherwise known as the cheapest 24-track studio in London. But what the studio lacked in prestige, it more than made up for in atmosphere. It was an old dance hall, so it had a good feel. I liked the studio enough to use it myself on several occasions. My Sex Pistols demos were done there. I like it because the room was bass light, so when you took mixes home, the bass was always louder than you thought it would be, which was a good thing at the time. Everything about the session was very pleasant. I didn't spend much time in the studio, as Brian seemed to like what I did right away. He knew what he wanted, but he was never afraid to experiment, and he was ready to listen to any ideas. On the opening track, Needle in the Camel's Eye, Phil Manzanera's reverb-soaked guitar sound was achieved by Eno forcefully striking the arm of Manzanera's Fender Stratocaster, which he continued to do with overdubs, while perfectly syncing up two pulsing drum kits in time with Manzanera's playing, creating a rhythm pattern which surely had to be plucked from the Velvet Underground's handbook.
I'm waiting for my man.
Another massive highlight is the catchy Babies on Fire, where Robert Fripp's scathing, over-the-top solos almost completely drown out Eno's crunchy synth work, which was definitely a first. According to Eno, his aim was to avoid typical pre-written song structures, and instead come up with lyrics on the spot, drawing from a series of disconnected images in his mind that mirrored the logic of dreams. I wrote the lyrics at home with my girlfriend with a cassette of the backing track from the studio. I sang whatever came into my mind as the song played through. Frequently, they're just nonsense words or syllables. First, I try for the correct phonetic sound rather than the verbal meaning. It's the exact opposite of phonetic poetry, where words are changed into pure sounds. I take sounds and change them into words. A similar improvisational approach was taken on his follow-up, Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, a loose concept album that tackles espionage and the Chinese Communist Revolution, among other subjects. According to Brian Turrington, the Winkies bassist who played on the title track, Brian was definitely in control, calling the shots, but I wasn't asked to do any particular type of playing. I was quite lucky to basically get on with my style, and what I seemed to do was good enough. In other words, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Another track on Taking Tiger Mountain, Third Uncle, has been labeled as a proto-goth rock song, with its darkly menacing staccato guitar, light drumming, and creepy monotone vocals. The song was even covered by the goth rock pioneers Bauhaus. As much as Eno managed to steal the spotlight from his colleagues in Roxy Music and poke fun at the press, he actually never really enjoyed the concept of being a frontman or a giant showman himself. In fact, when he was forced to cut one of his solo tours short due to a collapsed lung, he was actually relieved that he had an excuse to stop. He was much more of a creative thinker who preferred time in the studio, rather than on the stage. Eno continued to create his own unique strain of experimental rock albums with his follow-up projects like Another Green World and Before and After Science, which were both critically revered, both had songs that charted, and remain excellent quality works today. But Before and After Science, Eno's very last foray into rock, took an arduous 2 years to record, which was quite unusual for him. Shortly after recording that album, he decided to go on hiatus from recording his own work for a few years and started doing more work for other people. He would later go on to create more projects where he was truly in his element, specifically his ambient soundtracks like Apollo, The Pearl, and several others. Eno producing projects for other musicians is another one of his truly great skills. Around 1974, after performing with the Velvet Underground at the Rainbow Theatre in London, Eno was lucky enough to secure an opportunity to produce John Cale's Fear and Nico's The End, which opens with Nico's haunting harmonium playing, chimes, and even a heartbeat metronome, all filtered through Eno's synthesizer on It Has Not Taken Long. Working with Nico and Cale was of course interesting. Both of them are very demanding people in a way, and so am I in another way. It was a very volatile situation, and those are the ones that interest me in music. We weren't sitting around patting each other on the back and saying, "Groovy, let's blow together." It was quite intense. Eno first met David Bowie when Bowie was doing his Wembley Empire residency during the Station to Station era. Eno was in attendance at one of the performances. I went backstage and we then drove back to where he was living in Maida Vale. He said he'd been listening to discreet music, which was interesting because at the time that was a very out there record, which was universally despised by the English pop press. He said he'd been playing it non-stop on his American tour, and naturally, flattery always endears you to someone. I thought, God, he must be smart. At the time, Bowie was suffering from various physical and mental ailments, which stemmed from a cocaine habit he still hadn't kicked. Bowie was also suffering from a creative drought and decided to leave LA. Like Eno, Bowie was absorbing a wealth of inspiration from German krautrock groups such as Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, Cluster, and Neu, as well as ambient world music. While in France, where Bowie had been producing Iggy Pop's debut solo record The Idiot, Bowie and his own producer Tony Visconti had Eno join them in their initial sessions at the Château d'Eauville in France. He was pretty much living at the edge of his nervous system, very tense, but as often happens, that translated into a sense of complete abandon in the work. One of the things that happens when you're going through traumatic life situations is your work becomes one of the only places where you can escape and take control. I think it's in that sense that tortured souls sometimes produce great work. Eno's role during the initial recordings for Low was to assist Visconti with overdubbing. While Bowie was absent for a few days, Eno spent time working on the key instrumental track, Varsava, and also Art Decade, which was originally a piano piece that Bowie initially rejected, changing his mind only after hearing Eno's ghostly overdubs. Brian said, "How would you like to do some synthesized music, like the kind of dreamy stuff I do? Because we'd run out of songs." The three of us were collaborating on side 2, which in fact starts out with my son Delaney, who was about 4 years old at the time, but who's a fairly good piano player, just going da 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 da. Brian had developed an affection for the little boy, and he was in the same room, and he said, "Wait a minute," and pushed Delaney off the piano and used that da-da-da as the first notes of side 2, the first 3 notes of Varsava. In Berlin, Bowie and Eno decided the creative directions of certain tracks on Heroes using oblique strategies, a card-based method of breaking creative mind blocks. Whenever they reached a creative impasse, they would consult the cards, and the instrumental for Sense of Doubt was almost entirely reliant on oblique strategies. It was like a game. We took turns working on it. He'd do one overdub, and I'd do the next. The idea was that each was to observe his own oblique strategy as closely as he could, and as it turned out, they were entirely opposed to one another. Effectively, mine said, try to make everything as similar as possible, and his said, emphasize differences. On one of the more cinematic tracks, Neukölln, named after a Turkish district in Berlin, Eno cloaked a grandiose saxophone solo from Bowie under his misty synth textures, sonically mirroring a Berlin winter chill. Bowie and Eno soon flew Robert Fripp out to contribute to the recording sessions, and Fripp ended up wringing out perfect symphonic guitar lines out of his guitar in the studio over a period of 6 sleep-deprived hours, taking his next flight home a mere 40 hours after he had arrived. Bowie and Eno were in mutual agreement that every single one of Fripp's first takes was perfect. I was completely out of my brain. I didn't know whether I was coming or going. I hadn't played as Robert Fripp for 3 years. I had no idea what I was going to do, no preconceptions. I just went in and did it. 2 highlights of Fripp's distinct guitar playing can be heard heavily on Beauty and the Beast and the title track Heroes, where Fripp's intricate pyrotechnics ride smoothly over Eno's oscillating VCS-3 drones. 3 influences on the track were Noise Hero, Kraftwerk's Trans-Europe Express, and the Beach Boys' 1972 single Marcella. Another song that they had in constant heavy rotation was Donna Summer's I Feel Love, a pulsing disco synth groove that Eno came across during a stroll across Notting Hill's Portobello Road. He heard the track again in a record shop on Oxford Street, and had determined that song to be the musical future. Bowie and Eno devoted themselves to the sessions fully, almost to a detrimental end, sacrificing several nights of sleep and risking their physical health to make the album turn out exactly how they wanted it to sound. It was really slummy. We'd sit around the kitchen table at dawn feeling a bit tired and a bit fed up. Me with a bowl of crummy German cereal and him with his album men from the egg running down his shirt. The result was a record that RCA promoted much more heavily than its predecessor, Low. Heroes shot to the top 5 soon after being released. Eno was later invited to tour with Bowie, but ultimately declined in order to focus on other creative ventures. At the time of recording the 3rd album in the trilogy, Lodger, Eno had been listening to Night Flight by the Walker Brothers before flying out to work with Bowie at Mountain Studios in Switzerland. Some of the band members included Adrian Belew, who had played in King Crimson and also performed with Frank Zappa's band, and also violinist Simon House from Hawkwind. The studio was described by Belew as a space that looked like a World War II bunker, where the musicians could be seen through the windows of the mixing desk, but not vice versa. Bowie decided to name the album Lodger, since most of the songs had explored the idea of self-imposed exiles and outsiders who felt geographically displaced. The album's sound was what Bowie, Visconti, and Eno were calling hybridism at the time, a genre that we now call world music, where a multitude of sounds blend together and more than one cultural musical tradition intermingle. The song African Night Flight, whose title was a nod to the Walker Brothers album that both Bowie and Eno had been listening to at that point, was inspired by a trip that Bowie took to Kenya with his son. The sound had Eno scattering Bowie's off-kilter vocals over a clattering electronic percussion. When Eno produced the song Boys Keep Swinging, a garage-leaning parody of the Village People's YMCA, he had the band swap their instruments, with the guitarist playing the drums, the drummer playing bass, the bassist playing keyboards, and Tony Visconti on guitar. The result was a UK top 10 hit song accompanied by a music video where Bowie dresses in drag at a cabaret, which was inspired by his former Berlin Flame, club owner, performer, and trans icon, Romy Haag. The setting is a complete one-to-one copy of The Stage in My Club. He's performing one of my favorite numbers. There's this one part of the video where he smears his makeup and rips off his wig, my signature move. The Lodger sessions had slightly more tension than the Heroes sessions, and Bowie would eventually grow disillusioned with Eno's conceptual approach to everything. But to this day, the Berlin Trilogy remains one of Bowie's best and most critically lauded works to date, which can largely be traced to the incredible working chemistry he had with Eno. In between the time he worked on Heroes and Lodger, Eno produced the angular post-punk outfit Devo's first album, elaborately titled Q, Are We Not Men? A, We Are Devo. But the creative differences resulted in a great deal of tension and friction. According to Eno, the band were extremely anal in their approach to recording. They were a terrifying group of people to work with, because they were so unable to experiment. I'd be sitting there at the desk and there are EQs, echo sends, all these kinds of things, and my hand would sort of sneak up to put a bit of a treatment on something, and I could feel Jerry Casal bristling behind me. It was awful. He would stand behind me all the time and then lean over and say, "Why are you doing that?" Many of the tweaks that Eno had made to several tracks on Devo's album were ultimately nixed by the band as soon as the album was about to be mixed. But Eno's quintessential touch can still be heard on Shrivel Up and Space Junk, which are heavily coated in sheens of synthwaves. Despite the creative tension, Eno's respect for the band as a unit still remained, even championing their live show as the best live show he had ever seen. Eno later went on to produce 3 of the Talking Heads' defining albums, more songs about buildings and food, Fear of Music, and Remain in Light. The Talking Heads were just coming off the heels of their 1977 debut. David Byrne had been underwhelmed with the group, self-titled, and decided to collaborate with Eno in order for the band to hone their eclectic melange of influences. What appealed to me initially about their music was its powerful structural discipline. The rhythm section is like a ship or a train, very forceful and certain of where it's going. On top of that, you have this hesitant, doubting quality that dizzily asks, "Where are we going?" That makes for a sense of genuine disorientation, unlike the surface insanity of the more commonplace expressionist punk bands. During the recording sessions for Buildings and Food, Eno arranged the band's equipment into the configuration of a live setting, monitoring the sound through amplifiers instead of studio headphones. The band recorded their backing tracks in those live settings. As Jerry Harrison recounts in an interview, Eno taught us to use the studio as an instrument, to be fearless. In those days, studio people wore lab coats. It was like getting your blood taken. They're on that side of the glass, and you're on this side. Eno broke that down completely. Eno's imprint can be heard in the sine wave effect on Jerry Harrison's electric organ playing on The Girl Wants to Be with the Girls, as well as the repeated echo of the drums on Warning Sign. Developing an extremely close relationship with Talking Heads frontman David Byrne, Eno oversaw the production for Fear of Music as well, in which Eno's strong aptitude for improvisational sessions fit Byrne's sporadic songs. On Drugs, a track which the band was calling Electricity at the time, Eno had Byrne jogging up and down the vocal booth, resulting in a bewildered type of delivery and performance. On Memories Can't Wait, Eno utilized a cross-echoing reverb effect, which caused Byrne's vocals to bleed into the guitar feedback. On Electric Guitar, Eno managed to make Tina Weymouth's bass lines sound like spacious horn playing. The opening track on Fear of Music was based on a riff by the South African group Shasha and Jacquet on a song called Left Right Salute. Byrne was facing a creative block and failing to come up with any lyrics that stuck. After Eno encouraged Byrne to recite a chant from a found text, the group went with The Dadaist Manifesto by German author Hugo Ball. That song was generated from a group improvisation. It was a step forward in a lot of ways, and we suddenly thought, this is really quite close to what we'd been listening to. We realized that we were nearly there. In some sense, it was an interesting piece, but it presented a real dilemma for the Talking Heads in that it was a new format for them, and I really wanted to encourage that. The Talking Heads' follow-up album, Remain in Light, was largely influenced by Afrobeat groups like Fela Kuti, Funkadelic Parliament, and King Sunny Ade. One of the guest players on the album was King Crimson guitarist Adrian Belew, who Eno had worked with on Lodger, the third album in Bowie's Berlin trilogy. On the song The Great Curve, Eno instructed Belew to play real low notes and then go as high on the guitar as he could, every once in a while muting his pedal board, where David Byrne would recite a Yoruba worship chant. Remain in Light also took influence from Occidental post-punk groups. This is most apparent on the droning closing track, The Overload, where David Byrne does his best Ian Curtis impression over Eno's menacing ambient instrumental. Unfortunately, Eno and the band ended up having a falling out over royalties after wrapping up Remain in Light, which ended up putting a permanent strain on Eno's relationship with the band. Eno and David Byrne would maintain a positive working relationship and continue to collaborate on more projects together, but never again with the band. As Eno's close friend Colin Newman, frontman of the English post-punk group Wire, said, "There was talk of Wire working with Brian at the turn of the 80s. I was against it for one reason. I didn't want what had happened to the Talking Heads to happen to us. Although working with Brian, I might well have been the David Byrne character, and it would have been the others who felt like they had been sacked." Eno eventually returned to the studio after his hiatus, when a friendship was beginning to blossom between himself and the avant-garde composer and trumpet player John Hassell, and the two of them recorded an album together called Fourth World Volume 1, Possible Musics, which blended electric ambience with a variety of styles including disco funk and even krautrock. Eno's 1983 ambient masterpiece, Apollo, came to fruition when he was commissioned by documentary filmmaker Al Reiner to compose a score that would accompany NASA footage of the American Apollo space mission and the moon landing for Reinhardt's documentary, For All Mankind. The bulk of the album was made with Eno's Yamaha DX7, one of the first commercial digital synthesizers. He worked on the album with Bob Dylan's producer Daniel Lanois and his brother Roger Eno, who had just graduated from Colchester Music College. Daniel Lanois' pedal steel guitar playing on the celestial Deep Blue Day remains enchanting to this day, with Eno adding a bit of a honky-tonk flair to the track after hearing stories of Apollo astronauts listening to Buck Owens and Merle Haggard records. Eno's ambient work was yet another example of his ability to explore the deepest recesses of algorithm and sound manipulation with a variety of machines. Eno was an architect of sound, and he has left a permanent imprint on composers and left-field producers all around the world. Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails and his creative partner Atticus Ross are a dream duo who have constantly been compared to the creative partnership between Eno and Bowie. A few perfect modern examples of artists who stand on Eno's shoulders are the ambient techno producer Richard David James of Aphex Twin and the hyperpop PC music producer Sophie. Whenever she produced a track of her own or worked on an album for another musician, it was instantly recognizable as a quintessentially Sophie-infused project. And the same can be said for any piece of music that Eno touches. I think the best summation of Eno's ethos can be found in this New York Times interview that he gave in 2016. At the very end of the interview, the reporter asks him, "What's next for you?" And he answers, "I can't tell you." The reporter proceeds to ask him if his future plans are a secret. And he says, No, it's not a secret. I just can't tell until I see how it unfolds." Eno is historically one of the most talented and peculiar figures on the planet. He somehow made it to the top, with no financial backing of his own and no formal musical training. He's worked with nearly every respected name in the industry, has put out incredible acclaimed work of his own, and has bared it all in his published diaries, A Year with Swollen Appendices. And yet, he has still somehow managed to maintain a mystique. You could call it luck, you could call it sheer willpower, you could call it simply being in all the right places at the right time. But however he manages to achieve all that he has done, he certainly never ceases to surprise his audience. And that is why we will always pay attention